Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The child learned early that water shaped everything in this city. Water in the air, thick enough to taste. Water rising from the river, seeping through floorboards, pooling in courtyards after summer storms. The mother worked over steaming tubs, hands red and wrinkled, transforming soiled linens into something clean enough to return to the houses on Esplanade Avenue. The father disappeared for days at a time down to the docks, returning with coins that never seemed quite enough and stories about ships from places with impossible names. Their rooms sat above a tobacco shop, 3 cramped spaces that held everything they owned. The smell of drying laundry mixed with tobacco leaf and the sweet rot of the river. At night, voices drifted up from the street below. French, Spanish, English, and other languages the child couldn't name. The city spoke in layers, and understanding which language to use with which person became as natural as breathing. Madame Thibault lived 2 buildings over, in rooms that always smelled of dried herbs and something metallic the child couldn't identify. She was a midwife, though that word came later. At first, she was simply the woman people summoned in the middle of the night, the one who carried a worn leather bag and walked with purpose through streets most people feared after dark. She had a face like carved wood, dark skin creased with lines that suggested both laughter and worry, hands that moved with absolute certainty. The child began following her before understanding why. Perhaps it was the way people's faces changed when Madame Thibault arrived. Fear transforming into hope, pain into possibility. Or perhaps it was simpler. The midwife's rooms were quieter than home, and she sometimes had bread that wasn't stale, cheese that hadn't gone hard at the edges. You can sit there and be silent, or you can make yourself useful, Madame Thibault said one afternoon, not looking up from the plants she was sorting on her table. The child chose useful. The lessons came without announcement, embedded in daily tasks. Washing instruments in boiled water, grinding dried leaves with a mortar that was older than anyone could remember, learning to identify pennyroyal from mint, to know when raspberry leaf had been properly dried, to understand that ergot was powerful and dangerous and never to be handled carelessly. The child's hands grew skilled at tying knots, folding clean cloth into precise squares, measuring without scales. Madame Thibault delivered babies everywhere, in the narrow houses where 3 families shared a courtyard, in the neat cottages where free women of color maintained spotless rooms and careful distance from both enslaved people and whites, in the grand mansions where servants outnumbered family members. The geography of the city revealed itself through births, The child learned to read houses the way others read books, the height of ceilings indicating wealth, the presence of servants suggesting power, the quality of linens telling stories about what families could afford and what they pretended to afford. Women laboring brought their whole selves to the task, not just their bodies, but their fears, their prayers, their superstitions. Some wanted windows open to let the old soul out and the new soul in. Others demanded every opening sealed against evil spirits. Some called for priests, others whispered to saints the church didn't recognize. Madame Thibault accommodated all of it with the same impassive expression, doing what worked, regardless of who claimed credit. "Watch their faces, not just their bodies," she instructed during a long labor in a stifling room near the market. "Fear makes everything harder. Your job is to be the one person in the room who isn't afraid, even when you are." The child understood this wasn't just about delivering babies. It was about managing the living. Husbands who paced and demanded and sometimes got in the way. Mothers-in-law who offered contradictory advice. Neighbors who appeared with remedies both helpful and harmful. The midwife orchestrated it all, allowing people to feel important while quietly doing what needed doing. By the time childhood properly ended, marked not by age, but by the first solo walk through dark streets to attend a birth, the essential education was complete. How to carry the bag so it didn't bang against your hip. Which streets to avoid at which hours. How to knock so people knew it was the midwife and not someone else. How to accept payment gracefully, whether it was coins or a chicken or a promise. How to forget what you heard in houses where secrets lived alongside families. The apprenticeship formalized something already underway. Madame Thibault's reputation opened doors, and the young apprentice learned to stand quietly in corners, to hand over instruments before being asked, to know when to speak and when silence served better. The work was exhausting. Births didn't respect sleep schedules or meal times or the body's need for rest. But it was also something else, something the apprentice didn't have words for yet. It was being necessary, being trusted, being present at the moment when everything changed and life insisted on continuing despite all obstacles. The young midwife in training began recognizing patterns the city tried to hide. Which families paid wealthy midwives from the American sector to attend births that were then quietly adopted by others? Which women appeared in Madame Thibault's room seeking herbs that prevented or ended pregnancies, their faces desperate and determined? Which babies were welcomed and which were burdens their mothers could barely afford? The city ran on secrets, and midwives kept more of them than priests. Small dreams took shape during these years. A dress that wasn't patched and repatched. Shoes that kept water out. A room with a door that locked, where nobody else's belongings crowded against your own. A full belly, not just on Sunday. These weren't grand ambitions, they were practical calculations about what life might offer someone born without advantages, but learning a trade that people needed. Madame Thibault's hands began shaking slightly during delicate work. She didn't mention it, but the apprentice noticed everything now. The careful way the older woman braced herself standing, the moments of confusion that passed quickly, the increasing reliance on her assistant's steadier grip. The transfer of knowledge accelerated, as if both understood time was limited and there was still so much to learn. The city continued its rhythms around them, ships arriving, goods flowing through the port, fortunes made and lost, languages blending into new patterns. celebrations erupting in streets where yesterday there had been ordinary life. Yellow fever came some summers, and then the midwives became layers out of the dead as often as welcomers of the living. Those seasons taught their own lessons about the fragility of everything and the stubborn persistence of hope. By 17, the apprentice could handle most births without supervision. By 18, the city's working families began requesting the younger midwife by name. The transition happened gradually, then suddenly. Madame Thibault still accepted calls, but increasingly sent her apprentice alone, trusting years of training to hold firm under pressure. The work became identity. Not just what you did, but who you were. Someone people summoned in their most vulnerable moments. Someone who walked through the night unafraid, or at least appearing unafraid, which amounted to the same thing. Someone who knew how to hold life steady when it threatened to slip away, and how to let go gracefully when holding on served no purpose. The foundations were laid, the skills, the reputation, the understanding of how this city worked and where someone with neither family wealth nor social position might carve out a place worth occupying. What came next would build on these years, these lessons, these careful observations about power and secrets and the price of knowledge. But that belonged to tomorrow. Tonight, there was another birth to attend, another family waiting, another chance to do the work that mattered. Independence arrived not with celebration, but with exhaustion and a leather bag that now belonged entirely to the young midwife. Madame Thibault had passed quietly one winter morning, her work complete, her knowledge transferred as fully as such things could be transferred. The rooms above the tobacco shop felt emptier now, though nothing physical had changed. The calls came steadily. A fisherman's wife near the levee, laboring through the night, while her husband paced outside, smoking a pipe that had gone cold hours ago. A seamstress in the quarter, whose water broke while she was finishing a commissioned dress, torn between worry for the baby and worry about completing the work that would pay next month's rent. A widow, who already had 6 children and wept quietly throughout her labor, not from pain, but from the weight of another mouth to feed. Each birth taught something Madame Thibault's instruction hadn't quite captured. The way a mother's fear could stall labor completely, requiring patience and reassurance until her body remembered what to do. The peculiar silence that fell over a room when something went wrong, when everyone present understood without words that this might not end well. The fierce joy when a baby finally cried after terrifying seconds of silence, when death stepped back and allowed life to continue. The young midwife learned to carry that bag through every weather, every hour. Summer storms that turned streets into rivers, winter fogs that made familiar corners strange and threatening, the sticky heat of August, when even breathing felt like work, and labor rooms became unbearable furnaces. The bag grew heavier with additions, instruments purchased carefully from savings, remedies mixed and bottled, cloths that were washed and rewashed until they were soft enough for newborn skin. Payment arrived in forms as varied as the city itself. Coins when families had them, which wasn't always. Fresh fish, still smelling of the lake. Vegetables from someone's garden. A length of fabric. A promise to remember the kindness when fortune improved. The midwife accepted everything with the same calm expression Madame Thibault had worn, understanding that pride was a luxury working people couldn't afford. A friendship formed with Celeste, who worked in a shop that sold buttons and ribbons and other small necessities. They'd known each other slightly for years, but proximity became connection after Madame Thibault's death. Celeste had a sharp tongue and sharper observations about the customers who passed through her shop, about which families were rising and which were quietly selling their possessions, about who was marrying whom and why. "You hear secrets in birthing rooms," Celeste said one Sunday afternoon, sharing chicory coffee in her neat room behind the shop. "I hear them in mine. Between us, we probably know everything worth knowing in this city." The midwife smiled but said nothing. There was knowing, and there was speaking about knowing, and the difference between them was the difference between having work and losing it. The wealthy houses began calling more frequently. At first, it was older Creole families who'd known Madame Thibault, testing whether her apprentice had truly learned the craft. Then, Americans from the Garden District, the newer money that was reshaping the city, building bigger houses and demanding services that matched their ambitions. These calls paid better, substantially better, enough to afford a small room in a better location, away from the damp and noise of the river district. The differences between houses became starkly visible. In the modest homes, women labored surrounded by family and neighbors, everyone helping, or at least trying to help. In the wealthy homes, women labored in dedicated rooms, attended by servants who fetched and carried but maintained careful distance, preserving the social order even in crisis. The midwife moved between these worlds, equally necessary in both, equally outside both. A difficult birth in a clerk's household taught caution about trust. The baby was breech, requiring careful manipulation and steady nerves. The midwife worked through the night, finally delivering a healthy boy as dawn broke. The mother wept with relief. The father promised generous payment. When the midwife returned a week later to check on mother and child, the family had moved, leaving no forwarding information and no payment. The landlord shrugged. People disappeared in this city all the time, owing money to everyone. The lesson settled deep. Kindness had limits. Trust required verification. And even successful work didn't guarantee reward. Madame Thibault had tried to teach this, but some knowledge only arrived through experience. The work itself grew more confident. The midwife's hands learned to read labor through touch, how dilated, how soon, whether something was positioned wrong. The ability to project calm became second nature, even when fear twisted through the stomach, even when every instinct screamed that this birth might go terribly wrong. Women in labor watched the midwife's face, taking their cues from her expression. So the expression stayed steady, competent, unworried. Yellow fever arrived that summer with particular vengeance. The midwife attended births where mothers were already sick, delivering babies who might not have mothers by week's end. Some families fled to the country if they had country to flee to. Others stayed because leaving required resources they didn't possess. The smell of lime and burning sulfur filled the streets. Church bells rang constantly for the dead. And still, babies insisted on being born, indifferent to epidemics and fear. A call came late one August evening to a house on Rampart Street. The mother was a free woman of color, a dressmaker with a reputation for exquisite work. Her house was modest but immaculate. everything arranged with careful precision. She labored alone except for one elderly aunt. No husband, no explanation offered, none requested. The birth proceeded normally until the final moments when the mother hemorrhaged badly, blood soaking through cloths faster than the midwife could replace them. The knowledge came instantly, automatically. Ergot to contract the uterus. Pressure applied exactly right. Instructions delivered in a voice that allowed no argument. The mother survived, barely. The baby, a girl, cried lustily. The aunt pressed coins into the midwife's hands with trembling fingers. "You saved them both. God will remember." Walking home through dawn streets still smelling of smoke from the fever fires, the midwife understood something Madame Thibault had known but never quite articulated. This work wasn't just skill. It was carrying other people's terror, their hope, their desperate need for someone to know what to do when everything spun out of control. It was being steady, when steadiness was the only thing between life and death. The room with its own door, the dress that was whole and clean, the shoes that kept feet dry. These things arrived gradually, earned through nights without sleep, through walking miles in darkness, through being available when needed, regardless of personal comfort. They were small victories, but they belonged entirely to the person who'd earned them. Nobody had given them as charity or favor. Celeste noticed the changes. "You're doing well," she observed, examining the new shawl the midwife had purchased. "People talk about you. They say you're as good as old Madame Thibault. Maybe better." Reputation was capital in a world where working people had little else. It opened doors, commanded better payment, provided a buffer against disaster. But reputation was also fragile, dependent on discretion and success, vulnerable to rumor and accident. The midwife guarded it carefully, saying less than she knew, promising only what could be delivered, maintaining the professional distance that kept work separate from personal entanglement. Still, there were moments of simple pleasure. Morning coffee with Celeste, sharing observations about the city's endless theater, a new instrument purchased after saving for months, its weight perfect in the hand. Successfully delivering twins when everyone expected disaster. The grudging respect in an old physician's eyes after the midwife solved a problem he'd given up on. The city continued changing. More Americans arrived, bringing their money and their certainty that everything could be bought or rebuilt. The old Creole families watched this transformation with mixture of disdain and pragmatism, marrying their children to American money when necessary, maintaining French as the language of refinement. The midwife moved through all of it, attending births in households that barely acknowledged each other's existence, carrying her bag between worlds that touched only at their edges. At night, when exhaustion finally permitted sleep, dreams sometimes mixed births together, rooms and faces and crises blending into surreal combinations. But morning always arrived with another call, another family, another chance to do the work that defined everything now. The foundation was solid. The reputation was growing. The future seemed possible in ways childhood had never suggested. What came next would build on these years of learning to navigate a city that revealed itself only to those who paid attention, who understood that power had layers and that knowledge, carefully managed, could be its own kind of power. Spring arrived with magnolias blooming in the squares and humidity that promised the brutal summer ahead. The midwife had been working independently for years now, name passed between families like currency, reputation solid enough to command fees that allowed for modest comfort and even small savings hidden in a tin box under the floorboards. The messenger arrived on a Tuesday evening, just as the light was fading, a house servant in livery that spoke of serious wealth. The Levine family required assistance, immediately if possible. The address was on Esplanade Avenue, one of those grand houses set back from the street behind iron fencing and mature oaks. The kind of house where physicians usually attended births, where midwives were summoned only when physicians had failed, or when discretion mattered more than social appearances. The midwife gathered the bag, checked its contents by habit, and followed the servant through streets that grew progressively quieter and more elegant. Gas lamps glowed behind curtained windows. Carriages stood waiting outside houses where evening gatherings were just beginning. The noise and press of the working districts fell away, replaced by a studied calm that money purchased and maintained. The Levine house rose 3 stories, all galleries and shuttered windows, the kind of architecture that suggested generations of wealth rather than recent acquisition. A slave woman opened the door before the midwife could knock, face carefully blank, gesturing toward the stairs with practiced deference. The interior smelled of beeswax and old money, everything polished and perfect and slightly intimidating in its refinement. Upstairs, the birthing room was larger than the midwife's entire living space. A massive bed dominated the center, and around it moved several women, servants, relatives, perhaps a sister or cousin. The mother lay propped against pillows, face drawn with pain and fear, and something else the midwife couldn't immediately identify. She was younger than expected, barely past 20, with the particular pallor that suggested she'd been laboring for many hours already. An older woman stepped forward, introducing herself as Madame Levine, the mother-in-law. Her face was handsome and hard, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The physician gave up 2 hours ago. He said the baby was positioned wrong and there was nothing more he could do. I was told you have skills he lacks. The midwife approached the bed, meeting the laboring woman's eyes before speaking. May I examine you? Permission came in a desperate nod. The examination revealed what the physician had missed or given up on. A baby, positioned awkwardly but not impossibly. A labor stalled by fear and exhaustion. A mother who'd been told she was dying and had begun to believe it. The situation was difficult but manageable with patience and the kind of manipulation that required steady hands and absolute certainty. The baby can be turned, the midwife said quietly, projecting the calm that was half genuine skill and half practiced deception. It will be uncomfortable, but it can be done. The work took concentration that blocked out everything else, the watching women, the elegant room, the weight of the family's expectations. Just hands and body, and the careful pressure that coaxed the baby into better position, degree by degree, ignoring the mother's gasps of pain, because the alternative was worse. Time dissolved into the work until finally, blessedly, everything aligned properly, and labor could progress as it should have from the beginning. The baby arrived near midnight, a boy, healthy and furious at his rough introduction to the world. The mother wept with relief. The watching women exhaled collectively. Madame Levine's expression softened momentarily before reassembling itself into proper aristocratic composure. The midwife performed the necessary tasks, clearing the baby's airways, checking for problems, cutting and tying the cord, delivering the afterbirth, ensuring the mother wasn't hemorrhaging. Standard procedures executed with the automatic precision that came from years of practice. But something felt wrong. Some detail nagging at the edge of awareness. The baby's appearance, that was it. The hair was darker than either parent suggested, the features subtly wrong for a child of this particular couple. The midwife had seen enough babies to recognize when inheritance didn't follow expected patterns, when a child revealed secrets parents preferred hidden. The moment of recognition must have shown on her face, because Madame Levine's eyes narrowed slightly, measuring, calculating. The older woman stepped closer, voice dropping to a tone only the midwife could hear. "You've done excellent work tonight. The family is grateful." It wasn't a statement. It was a test, an acknowledgement, a warning, all compressed into one sentence. The midwife understood instantly. This birth contained complications that had nothing to do with medical difficulty. The baby's appearance told a story the family needed untold, and the midwife had just revealed that she could read that story. The younger Madame Levine seemed oblivious, lost in exhausted relief, cradling her son with the fierce protectiveness of someone who'd faced death and emerged victorious. But the elder Madame Levine watched the midwife with eyes that missed nothing, waited for some response that would indicate whether discretion could be trusted or whether problems needed solving. "Every baby is a miracle," the midwife said carefully, wrapping the infant and placing him in his mother's arms. "This one especially, after such difficulty." The tension in the room shifted almost imperceptibly. Madame Levine nodded once, a gesture that conveyed understanding and approval and subtle threat. "You'll return tomorrow to check on them both, and the day after. We want to ensure full recovery." It was an order disguised as a request, a way of binding the midwife to the household, ensuring continued contact, and therefore continued opportunity to assess her trustworthiness. The midwife agreed, because refusing would have been both professionally insulting and practically dangerous. The rest of the night passed in careful normality. Instructions were given about care for mother and infant. Questions were answered with professional competence. Payment was offered and accepted, a sum far more generous than standard fees. Heavy coins pressed into the midwife's hand by Madame Levine, with a look that made their purpose clear. This wasn't just payment for services. It was the beginning of an arrangement. Compensation for blindness. Investment in silence. Walking home through empty streets as dawn approached, the leather bag felt heavier than it should. The coins represented more money than a month of regular work might bring, maybe 2 months. They also represented something more complicated and potentially more dangerous. Knowledge that powerful people preferred hidden. Awareness that made the knower valuable and vulnerable simultaneously. Celeste would want to hear about the grand house, the elegant room, the wealthy family. But some things couldn't be shared, even with friends. Especially with friends. The best way to keep a secret was to let nobody know you carried one. Sleep came eventually, but brought strange dreams. Babies with wrong faces. Rooms that shifted and changed, voices speaking words that made no sense. The body understood what the mind was still processing. Something had changed tonight. Some line had been crossed, and the simple work of bringing babies into the world had acquired complications that skill alone couldn't navigate. 3 days later, a messenger arrived with another generous payment, delivered with a brief note thanking the midwife for exceptional discretion as well as exceptional skill. The message was clear. The family had been watching, testing, and had decided the midwife could be trusted, or at least could be managed through a combination of money and implicit threat. Other calls from wealthy families followed over subsequent weeks. Word traveled through channels the midwife couldn't quite trace. Drawing rooms where women took tea, conversations between servants who knew more about their employers than the employers suspected. The invisible networks that connected New Orleans society. The Levines family's approval opened doors, and behind those doors waited more secrets, more complicated births, more situations where medical skill mattered less than social discretion. The midwife's earnings increased substantially. Better lodging became possible, then actual comfort, then small luxuries that would have seemed fantastical years ago. But the work no longer felt quite the same. Every birth in a wealthy household now carried the weight of watching eyes, of families assessing whether this midwife could be trusted with whatever secrets might emerge in vulnerable moments. The bag of instruments had become something else, a license to enter private worlds, a burden of knowledge, a target painted on someone who'd simply wanted to practice a craft and earn a living. Celeste noticed the change. "You look tired all the time now," she observed one Sunday afternoon. "Even when you've slept. Wealthy families wear you down differently than poor ones." The midwife managed a smile that didn't quite convince either of them. Different problems, same work. But it wasn't the same work anymore, and both of them knew it. The midwife had stumbled into something larger and more dangerous than delivering babies. The complicated machinery of how powerful families protected their reputations, managed their scandals, ensured that certain truths remained buried regardless of cost. And having glimpsed that machinery, having demonstrated usefulness to it, there was no simple way to step back into ignorance. The knowing had begun, and knowledge, once acquired, couldn't be unlearned. It could only be carried, carefully and quietly, like all the other weights that came with surviving in a city built on secrets. The months following the Lavinia birth settled into a rhythm that felt both prosperous and precarious. Wealthy families continued calling, their payments allowing for comforts that younger self could never have imagined. A room with proper furniture, clothes that weren't mended, meals that included meat more than once a week. The leather bag grew worn from constant use, its contents regularly replenished with supplies purchased from the best apothecaries. But prosperity brought its own weight. Every knock at the door triggered a moment of assessment. Was this a routine call or something more complicated? Every wealthy household visited came with the unspoken question of what secrets might be witnessed this time. What knowledge might need to be forgotten immediately upon acquisition? The Levine family sent periodic summons. Small matters, supposedly, checking on the young mother's recovery, examining the baby to ensure proper development, attending a cousin's lying in, advising a sister-in-law about fertility remedies. Each visit came with generous payment and the underlying reminder that the family kept track of their investments. The midwife was being woven into their world, thread by careful thread, until pulling away would mean unraveling everything. The baby, young Henri, they called him, grew into a healthy infant, whose features became more pronounced with each month. The resemblance to Monsieur Levine remained conspicuously absent, though nobody acknowledged this fact aloud. The household staff maintained perfect discretion, their faces blank whenever the baby was discussed. The young mother doted on her son with fierce devotion that suggested she either didn't notice the questions his appearance raised or had decided not to care. One afternoon, while checking on the mother's health, the midwife encountered another visitor leaving the house. A woman of middle age, well-dressed, but not quite wealthy. Something furtive in her hurried departure. Their eyes met briefly in the hallway, and recognition flashed between them, though they'd never met. This woman knew something, carried some piece of the puzzle, but she disappeared down the stairs before any words could be exchanged. Later, one of the household slaves, an older woman who'd been with the family for decades, appeared in the birthing room on some pretext about linens. Her presence lingered after the stated purpose was complete. Finally, voice barely above a whisper, "You seem like someone who understands things, who knows how to be careful." The midwife continued packing instruments, not looking up, not responding directly, allowing space for whatever was coming. "There are those who'd pay well for certain information about this household," the woman continued, still pretending to arrange linens. "People who remember old grievances, people who'd like to see the Levines brought low." Now the midwife did look up, meeting the woman's eyes. "I'm a midwife, not a gossip. What I see in houses stays in houses." The woman studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Good. That's the safe answer, the smart answer. Though I wonder sometimes if staying safe is the same as doing right." She left before the midwife could respond, if response had even been possible. But the encounter confirmed what was becoming increasingly clear. The secret about Henri's parentage wasn't as secure as the Levines believed. Other people knew fragments. Other people were watching. And the midwife, by virtue of having been present at the birth, occupied some crucial position in a game whose rules remained frustratingly opaque. Celeste noticed the distraction during their Sunday coffee. "You're somewhere else entirely today." The midwife attempted focus, dragging attention back to the present moment, to her friend's shop-worn hands wrapped around a cup, to the comfortable familiarity of this routine. "Just tired, you know how it is." But Celeste wasn't fooled. "I know how it is when work is simply exhausting. This is different. You're carrying something heavy, something that isn't about tired feet and lost sleep." The temptation to confide rose like floodwater, pushing against the walls of professional discretion. Celeste was trustworthy, had proven that over years. But involving her in whatever complex situation was developing around the Levine family would be unfair, potentially dangerous. The midwife swallowed the urge to share and manufactured a smile instead. "Some families are more demanding than others. That's all." Celeste accepted this obvious deflection with visible reluctance, letting the subject drop, but making clear through her expression that the conversation wasn't forgotten, merely postponed. Strange incidents began accumulating. A near accident in the market when a cart lost its wheel moments after the midwife passed. Could have been chance. A client who canceled at the last moment with no explanation, then sent apologetic payment days later with a note saying she'd been advised to use a different midwife. Could have been ordinary circumstances. A man who seemed to appear on the same streets too frequently, always at a distance, never approaching but always watching. Could have been coincidence. Each incident alone meant nothing. Together, they suggested attention, someone observing, perhaps testing, perhaps waiting for something. The midwife began varying routes through the city, accepting calls from poorer families more frequently as counterweight to the wealthy households, trying to become less predictable and therefore less vulnerable. A second midwife, an older woman named Madame Rousseau, who'd practiced in the city for decades, approached after a chance encounter outside an apothecary. "I hear you're doing well. The better families speak highly of your discretion." It was phrased as compliment, but felt like something else. The midwife responded carefully. "I try to serve all my clients professionally." Madame Rousseau's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Of course, though some clients require more delicate handling than others. The Levine family, for instance. Such a complicated household, so many expectations to manage." There it was, the real purpose of this conversation. Madame Rousseau was fishing for information, trying to determine what the younger midwife knew and whether she might be willing to share it. The question was whether this represented genuine curiosity, competitive intelligence gathering, or something more dangerous. "Every household has complications," the midwife replied evenly. "My job is delivering healthy babies, not untangling family matters." The older woman's expression flickered, disappointment or perhaps approval, hard to distinguish. A wise position, though wisdom and survival aren't always the same thing in this city. Sometimes what we know becomes more dangerous than what we do. She departed before the midwife could ask what she meant by that cryptic observation, but the message was clear enough. Others were aware of the Levine secret, and the midwife's connection to it had not gone unnoticed. The web of watchers and knowledge seekers spread wider than initially understood. Sleep became difficult. Dreams mixed past births with imagined disasters, complications that had actually occurred, blending with fears about complications yet to come. The mind insisted on rehearsing scenarios. What if someone demanded information about the Levine birth? What if the family decided the midwife knew too much? What if staying silent became impossible, or staying silent made things worse? During a routine call to the Levine household, checking on the young mother's general health, a transparent excuse for ensuring continued contact, Madame Levine, the elder, intercepted the midwife in the downstairs parlor. Her manner was cordial, but contained an edge that hadn't been present in earlier encounters. "You've been very professional in your dealings with this family," she began, seating herself in a way that suggested this wasn't a casual conversation. "We appreciate discretion. We value loyalty. These qualities are rare and worth rewarding." The midwife remained standing, bag in hand, maintaining the posture of someone ready to leave. "I simply do my work." "Yes, and you do it well, which is why I want to ensure you understand the full scope of our appreciation." Madame Levine opened a small box on the side table, revealing more money than 3 months of regular work might generate. "A gift. Call it a retainer. We anticipate needing your services regularly, for various family members, various situations. It would be convenient to know you're available when required. It was a bribe, obviously, but it was also a trap, a way of creating financial dependence that would make future refusals difficult. Accepting meant acknowledging the arrangement, understanding that this wasn't just payment for medical services, but compensation for something larger and less defined. Refusing meant insulting a powerful family and losing lucrative work. It also meant maintaining some degree of independence, keeping distance between professional obligation and personal entanglement. The midwife looked at the money, calculating rapidly. Bills needed paying. Winter was approaching. The leather bag needed replacing soon, worn beyond reasonable repair. Practical concerns versus undefined dangers. Security versus freedom. The choice should have been obvious, but somehow wasn't. "I appreciate the family's generosity," the midwife said slowly, choosing words with surgical care. "I'm happy to provide services as needed, as my schedule permits. But I can't accept payment for future work that may or may not be required. It wouldn't be professional." Madame Levine's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. A test had been administered, and the response had surprised her, not necessarily in a good way. "I see. You prefer maintaining independence. How admirable. And how potentially inconvenient." The temperature in the room seemed to drop despite the season. "I prefer keeping my arrangements clear. Services provided, payment rendered. Simple and straightforward." "Nothing is ever simple or straightforward in New Orleans," Madame Levine replied, closing the box with a decisive snap. "But very well. We'll continue as we have been. Though I hope you'll remember that this family has been generous to you. We value loyalty, as I said, but we also have long memories for disloyalty." The dismissal was implicit and absolute. The midwife left the house feeling both relieved and deeply uneasy, aware that some crucial moment had just occurred, but uncertain whether the right choice had been made. Independence preserved, yes, but at what cost? The Levines weren't people who accepted rejection gracefully, even rejection phrased as professional standards. Walking through afternoon streets crowded with vendors and shoppers and the usual chaos of city life, the midwife understood that something had shifted fundamentally. The Levine secret was no longer just an awkward knowledge to be carefully forgotten. It had become the center of forces pulling from multiple directions, the family wanting silence, others wanting information, and the midwife trapped in the middle, trying to navigate between dangers that became clearer with each passing day, while simultaneously becoming more complicated and less escapable. Autumn arrived with cooler nights and the first hints that summer's brutality might eventually end. The midwife maintained routines with deliberate normalcy, attending births across all districts, checking on mothers and infants, mixing remedies, keeping the professional facade intact even as awareness grew that nothing was quite as simple as it appeared. The Levine family continued requesting services, though the warmth had drained from their interactions. Now the calls came through formal notes rather than trusted servants. Payments arrived exactly calculated without the previous generosity. And encounters with Madame Levine the Elder carried a chill that no courtesy could disguise. The message was clear. The midwife had declined to become fully complicit, And while outright hostility wasn't warranted, neither was favor. Young Henri grew into an energetic child, whose features increasingly proclaimed the secret his family worked so hard to obscure. The midwife visited periodically. Professional obligations regarding the mother's ongoing health provided legitimate excuse, and watched the household navigate its unspoken crisis with elaborate performances of normalcy. Monsieur Levine doted on the boy with determination that might have been genuine affection, or might have been something more complicated. The young mother protected her son with fierce devotion that suggested she knew exactly what dangers surrounded him and had decided that love mattered more than truth. A new presence entered the picture during one of these visits. A woman introduced as Madame Levine's cousin, though her features suggested no family resemblance. She was perhaps a decade older than the midwife, with sharp eyes that catalogued everything and a manner that oscillated between excessive friendliness and barely concealed contempt. Her name was Madame Fontenot, and she asked too many questions about medical procedures, about what could be determined from examining infants, about whether certain features were conclusive evidence of parentage. The midwife deflected with professional vagueness, explaining that babies changed considerably as they grew, that resemblance was unpredictable, that medical knowledge had limits. But Madame Fontenot's interest felt less like curiosity and more like reconnaissance, gathering information for purposes left carefully unstated. Celeste provided unexpected insight during one of their Sunday meetings. "I know that name, Fontenot. She comes into the shop sometimes, buying things she doesn't need, asking questions about other customers. She's connected to the Mercier family, old Creole money that's been declining for years. There's bad blood between the Merciers and the Levines, something about a business deal that went wrong decades ago." The pieces began arranging themselves into a clearer picture. The Levine secret wasn't just a family embarrassment to be managed. It was potential ammunition in old conflicts, a weapon that enemies might use to damage reputation and social standing. And the midwife, having been present at Henri's birth, occupied a crucial position. The witness whose testimony could confirm or deny whatever accusations might eventually surface. A different kind of summons arrived one evening, not from the Levines, but from a lawyer's office, requesting consultation about a medical matter. The address was in the commercial district, respectable but not elite. The midwife debated refusing, but curiosity won over caution. The lawyer was a thin man, with careful hands and eyes that revealed nothing. He offered coffee, which the midwife declined, then got directly to business. "I represent certain parties interested in establishing facts about births that occurred in wealthy households. Your name has come up as someone who might have relevant knowledge." The midwife's stomach tightened, but the expression remained neutral. "I attend many births. I don't discuss my clients." Admirable discretion. However, there are situations where discretion becomes complicity, where remaining silent protects wrongdoing rather than privacy. He slid a paper across the desk, a document dense with legal language. "This is a deposition request. You would simply need to confirm certain facts about a birth you attended. Nothing more." The midwife didn't touch the paper. "What birth?" "The Levine infant, born approximately 2 years ago. You were the attending midwife." There it was, the trap laid out explicitly. Answer the questions and betray the family's confidence. refuse, and potentially face legal consequences, lie, and risk perjury charges. The lawyer's expression suggested he'd run this scenario before, that he knew exactly how to pressure working people with no resources to fight back. "I'd need to consult my records," the midwife said carefully, buying time. The lawyer smiled without warmth. "Of course. Take a few days. But understand that cooperation now would be voluntary and compensated. Cooperation later, under subpoena, would be mandatory and unrewarded. Think carefully about which serves your interests better." The walk home felt longer than usual. The familiar streets, suddenly hostile. Every shadowed doorway might hide someone watching. Every passerby might be connected to the invisible forces pulling at this situation. The lawyer's offer wasn't really an offer. It was a warning that neutrality wasn't an option, that eventually a choice would be forced. Celeste listened to the edited version of events with growing concern. "You need to be careful. When powerful people fight, ordinary people get crushed between them. That's how it's always been." "I know, but I don't see a way to step aside. They've all decided I'm important to their various schemes." "Then you need leverage of your own, something that makes you more valuable protected than silenced." The suggestion made sense, but the execution remained unclear. What leverage could a midwife possibly have against wealthy families and their lawyers? Knowledge was the obvious answer, but knowledge was exactly what made the situation dangerous in the first place. A solution arrived from an unexpected direction. An elderly priest, Father Beaumont, who occasionally called the midwife to attend births among his parishioners, requested a meeting. They sat in the garden behind his church, surrounded by herbs he grew for medicinal purposes, his old hands carefully tending plants while he spoke. "I hear things in confession," he said quietly. "Not specifics, of course, but patterns. I know that you're caught in something difficult, that families are making demands you're not equipped to manage alone." The midwife said nothing, uncertain where this was leading. "The church has its own interests in these matters," Father Beaumont continued. "Questions of legitimacy, of inheritance, of proper recognition. But the church also has obligations to protect those who cannot protect themselves, including midwives caught between powerful forces." "What are you suggesting?" "That certain information, properly documented and placed in church custody, might serve as insurance. If something were to happen to you, if you were to face threats or worse, that documentation would become public. It's called making yourself too valuable to silence." The midwife considered this carefully. "You're suggesting I write down what I know and trust it to your keeping." "I'm suggesting you protect yourself. The church has survived centuries by understanding how power works. We can extend that protection to you if you're willing to accept it." It was tempting, trading individual vulnerability for institutional backing. But it also meant trusting the church with explosive information, betting that their interests aligned with the midwife's survival rather than some other agenda. Father Beaumont's face suggested genuine concern, but priests had their own pressures, their own complicated loyalties. "I'll think about it," the midwife said finally. The priest nodded, unsurprised. "Don't think too long. These situations have a way of accelerating." That night, the midwife sat with pen and paper, trying to articulate what exactly had been witnessed that night in the Levine household. The words came slowly, each sentence weighted with potential consequences. The baby's appearance, the family's reaction, the subsequent payments and veiled threats, the pattern of attention and intimidation that had followed. Reading it back, the document seemed both damning and inadequate. It proved nothing definitively, but implied everything dangerously. It was exactly the kind of testimony that could destroy the Levine family's reputation, while also making the midwife a permanent enemy of powerful people. The paper went into the leather bag, undecided. Insurance or suicide? Hard to tell the difference. Days passed with mounting tension. The Levine family sent another summons, this time for a trivial matter that clearly served as pretext to assess the midwife's current state of mind. Madame Fontenot appeared again, her questions more pointed, her manners suggesting that patience was wearing thin. The lawyer sent a follow-up note, the tone sharper, the implied threats less veiled. Celeste noticed the toll this was taking. "You're not sleeping. You're hardly eating. This is killing you slowly." "I'm managing." "You're surviving. That's not the same as managing. You need to make a decision. Take Father Beaumont's offer, take the lawyer's offer, or find some third option. But you can't just keep carrying this alone." The midwife knew she was right, but couldn't see the path forward clearly. Every option led to dangers that multiplied the more carefully they were examined. Silence protected nothing and pleased nobody. Speaking satisfied some parties while enraging others. Documentation provided security but also created permanent evidence. A birth call interrupted these circular thoughts. A young mother in the quarter, her first child, labor proceeding normally. The work provided temporary escape. Ours where skill mattered more than politics, where bringing a healthy baby into the world was the only goal that counted. The mother's joy afterward, her husband's relieved tears, the simple perfection of a newborn's grip around an offered finger. These things reminded the midwife why the work mattered, why it was worth protecting despite all complications. Walking home through pre-dawn streets, bag heavy with used linens that needed washing, the midwife understood something that had been obscured by fear and calculation. The work itself was the answer, not the wealthy families or their secrets, not the leverage or the protection, but the fundamental purpose, helping women survive childbirth, welcoming children safely into the world, using skill to fight back against death and suffering. That purpose couldn't be abandoned, no matter what threats emerged. Which meant finding a way to protect it, to preserve the ability to continue working, even as powerful people tried to use that work for their own purposes. The solution wasn't choosing between the various forces demanding cooperation. The solution was refusing to be useful to any of them, while remaining essential to all of them. The shape of a strategy began forming, still vague but promising. Not documentation or testimony or alliance, but something simpler and potentially more powerful. The question was whether courage could be found to implement it, and whether implementation would lead to freedom or disaster. Winter brought relief from the heat, but no relief from the pressure that had been building for months. The strategy that had seemed promising in the aftermath of exhaustion and crisis now required actual implementation, and the gap between concept and execution felt vast and treacherous. The midwife began by doing something unexpected, accepting every call from poor families, even when wealthier households offered better payment. The leather bag traveled through the cramped quarters near the docks, the crowded tenements where multiple families shared cooking facilities, the modest cottages where free people of color maintained their precarious position between enslaved and elite. These births paid little or nothing, but they served a different purpose. They rebuilt the foundation of reputation on something more solid than wealthy families' conditional approval. Word spread through the working districts that the midwife was available and willing, that payment could be whatever families could manage, that skill wasn't reserved exclusively for those who could afford it. The calls multiplied until sleep became a luxury rarely enjoyed, and the work became nearly unsustainable. But the strategy required this, becoming so necessary to so many people that removing one midwife would create widespread hardship that even powerful families couldn't ignore. Celeste watched this transformation with mixed concern and admiration. "You're working yourself to death. 3 births in 2 days. You can barely stand. I need to be essential, not just convenient for the wealthy, but necessary for everyone else. And when you collapse from exhaustion? When you make a mistake because you haven't slept in days?" The midwife had no good answer for that. The plan's weakness was obvious. It depended on maintaining impossible standards indefinitely, on physical endurance that had limits even determination couldn't overcome. But the alternative was remaining vulnerable to the various forces trying to use or silence her, and that had become intolerable. The Levine family noticed the shift. Another summons arrived, and this time Madame Levine the Elder's displeasure was explicit rather than merely implied. "I hear you're quite busy these days, too busy, perhaps, to properly serve the families who've been most generous to you." The midwife met her eyes steadily. "I serve all my clients to the best of my ability. The quality of care doesn't change based on what someone can pay." "How admirable, and how foolish. You could have had security, protection, a comfortable future. Instead, you've chosen to exhaust yourself for people who can't even compensate you properly." "I've chosen to do the work I was trained for. Nothing more complicated than that." Madame Levine's expression hardened. "Everything is more complicated than that in this city. You've been avoiding the lawyer's requests. You've been declining our invitations. You seem to think you can simply ignore the various parties interested in your knowledge. Let me assure you, that path leads nowhere good. I'm not ignoring anyone. I'm simply working, delivering babies, helping mothers survive. If people want to complicate that with their schemes, that's their choice, not mine." It was as close to defiance as the midwife had come, and the older woman registered it with something between anger and grudging respect. "You're being remarkably stubborn for someone in such a vulnerable position. I hope you don't come to regret it." The threat hung in the air after Madame Lavigne departed, but the midwife felt something unexpected beneath the fear, a kind of freedom that came from having named the situation plainly, from refusing to pretend the games weren't happening. Whatever came next would at least be honest conflict, rather than veiled manipulation. Father Beaumont's offer still stood, the promise of church protection if documentation was provided. But something about that arrangement felt wrong now. Too much like trading one form of dependency for another. The church had its own interests, its own political entanglements, its own reasons for wanting leverage over powerful families. Accepting their protection would mean becoming useful to them instead, and usefulness was exactly what the midwife was trying to escape. A new complication arrived in the form of Madame Rousseau, the older midwife who'd shown interest in the Levine situation months earlier. She appeared at a birth in a modest household, claiming she'd been called by the family, though nobody there recognized her name. Her presence was intrusive and inexplicable, watching the midwife work with an intensity that had nothing to do with professional interest. Afterward, as both women walked through the dark streets, Madame Rousseau spoke carefully. "You've put yourself in an interesting position. Too visible to silence quietly, too poor to threaten effectively, too busy to intimidate with legal harassment. It's almost clever. It's just work. Nothing is just work when you know what you know. But I'll tell you something useful, since we're in the same profession and I have fewer years ahead than behind. The Levine's secret isn't unique. Half the wealthy families in this city have similar arrangements. Children who aren't what they're claimed to be. Inheritances that rest on lies. Reputations built on carefully maintained fictions. If the Levines fall, others will be nervous. Very nervous." The midwife processed this new information. "You're saying other families have reason to want this particular secret protected?" "I'm saying the situation is more complicated than young Madame Levine's indiscretion and her mother-in-law's pride. There are stakes you haven't seen yet." "Then why are you telling me this?" Madame Rousseau smiled grimly. "Because I'm old enough to remember when midwives looked out for each other, instead of being used as weapons in rich people's wars. And because you're going to need allies if you want to survive what's coming." She departed before the midwife could ask what exactly was coming, leaving more questions than answers. But her warning aligned with the midwife's growing sense that the Levine situation was just one thread in a larger web, that pulling it would unravel more than anyone anticipated. An unexpected ally appeared from within the Levine household itself. The elderly slave woman, who'd warned the midwife months ago about people seeking information, approached after a routine visit. Her manner was cautious but determined. "Young Madame knows what her son looks like. She's not a fool, whatever her mother-in-law thinks, and she's terrified about what happens when the boy gets older and the resemblance becomes impossible to ignore." "What does she want from me?" "Nothing. She doesn't know I'm speaking to you, but I'm telling you because you seem like someone who might understand. That woman loves her child. Whatever happened, however it happened, she loves him. And if powerful people start fighting over the truth, he's the one who'll suffer most." The observation cut through all the strategic calculations and political maneuvering. At the center of this elaborate conflict was a child who had no responsibility for the circumstances of his birth, but would bear the consequences of whatever resolution emerged. Young Henri, growing up surrounded by tension he couldn't understand, protected by lies that might collapse at any moment. The midwife returned home that night to find a message slipped under the door, anonymous, written in careful script that suggested education, but revealed nothing about the author's identity. It contained just one sentence. The Mercier family plans to file suit challenging Henri Levine's legitimacy within the month. So that was the timeline. Whatever strategy was being implemented had to succeed quickly or become irrelevant. The midwife sat with this knowledge, weighing options that all seemed inadequate to the moment's demands. Celeste visited unannounced the next morning, unusual enough to signal importance. "I heard something in the shop yesterday. Madame Fontenot was talking to another woman about needing testimony from the midwife who attended a particular birth. She said one way or another that testimony would be obtained." One way or another sounds like a threat. It was absolutely a threat. These people aren't playing anymore. Whatever patience they had is gone. The midwife felt the walls closing in, the various forces converging, the impossible situation becoming actively dangerous. Working more wasn't going to solve this. Documentation wasn't going to solve this. Church protection wasn't going to solve this. The problem required a different approach entirely, something that addressed the fundamental issue rather than trying to navigate around it. The answer arrived with crystalline clarity during a birth that went badly, a mother hemorrhaging, the baby in distress. Minutes that felt like hours, where skill and luck and desperation all combined to keep two lives from slipping away. Afterward, sitting in the pre-dawn quiet with the exhausted but living mother and her crying but healthy daughter, the midwife understood what had been missing from all the strategic calculations. The truth itself was the answer. Not hidden, not weaponized, not traded for protection or leverage, but simply stated plainly, for anyone who cared to listen. The Levine family's secret wasn't actually secret. Too many people knew or suspected or had pieces of the puzzle. Maintaining the fiction required everyone's cooperation, everyone's silence, everyone's willingness to pretend ignorance for the sake of social peace. Breaking that required just one person refusing to cooperate. But stating truth didn't mean providing testimony to lawyers or feeding ammunition to enemies. It meant something simpler and potentially more powerful. Writing down exactly what had been witnessed, exactly what was known, and making that document public in a way that served no particular agenda except clarity. Not accusation, just observation. Not judgment, just fact. Let others draw their own conclusions and make their own decisions about what mattered and what didn't. The risk was enormous. The Levine family would be furious. The Mercier family would be disappointed if the revelation didn't serve their purposes. The church would lose potential leverage. The lawyer would lose a cooperative witness. Almost everyone with power in this situation would find reason to be angry. But the midwife would be free, no longer useful to anyone, no longer essential to any scheme, just someone who'd told the truth and stepped away from the consequences. Whether that led to safety or disaster remained uncertain, but at least it would be honest uncertainty, rather than the suffocating complexity of trying to satisfy everyone while protecting no one. The strategy solidified through the following days. Write the document carefully, stating only verifiable facts. Make copies. Distribute them through channels that ensured wide circulation. Leave one with Father Beaumont, one with Madame Rousseau, one with a newspaper editor known for publishing uncomfortable truths, one with the lawyer to demonstrate that cooperation wasn't the same as conspiracy. Then step back and let the city digest the information however it chose. Celeste listened to the plan with grave concern. "You're sure about this? Once those documents circulate, there's no taking them back. The Levines will come after you." "Maybe, Or maybe they'll realize that coming after me just draws more attention to what they wanted hidden. Either way, I'll have done what I should have done from the beginning, told the truth, and let others figure out what to do with it. And if they destroy you for it, the midwife smiled without humor, then at least I'll have been destroyed for something honest, instead of for trying to keep everyone happy while staying invisible. The document took 3 evenings to write properly, each word weighed against potential consequences, and the simple requirement of accuracy. No embellishment, no interpretation, just the facts as they had been witnessed. The baby's appearance at birth, the family's reaction, the subsequent payments that exceeded normal fees, the pattern of attention that had followed. Nothing about motives or morality, nothing that couldn't be verified, nothing that served anyone's agenda except truth's own stubborn insistence on existing. Making copies by hand was tedious work, but the midwife trusted no one else with the task. Each version needed to be identical, each word legible, each statement clear enough that misinterpretation became difficult. The final stack of documents represented weeks of anxiety compressed into several pages of careful prose, explosive and mundane simultaneously. The distribution happened over 2 days. Father Beaumont received his copy first, his old face grave as he read, his silence stretching long enough to suggest internal debate. Finally, "This will cause considerable turmoil." "Yes. The Levine family has been generous to the church. They'll see this as betrayal." "I'm not betraying anyone. I'm stating what I witnessed. What others do with that information is their decision." The priest folded the document carefully. "You're either very brave or very foolish, possibly both. The church will hold this in confidence until other copies become public. Then we'll acknowledge having received it independently. That provides you some protection. They can't claim you gave information exclusively to their enemies." Madame Rousseau accepted her copy with something approaching satisfaction. "About time someone refused to play their games. This won't make you popular, but it might make you safe. Hard to silence someone who's already spoken." The newspaper editor read the document twice before looking up, eyes sharp with professional interest. "You understand this will be published? That your name will be attached to it?" "I understand. The Levine family will deny everything. They'll claim you're lying, that you have ulterior motives, that you're being paid by their enemies. They can claim whatever they want. What I've written is what I witnessed. Whether people believe it is up to them." The editor's expression shifted to something like respect. "Most people in your position would have stayed quiet, taken money from whoever offered it, tried to play all sides. Why didn't you?" The midwife considered the question honestly. "Because I want to keep delivering babies, and I can't do that while being useful to everyone's schemes. The only way out was through." The lawyer received his copy last, delivered with a brief note explaining that the information he'd requested was now being made public through multiple channels, rendering any deposition unnecessary. His response arrived that same evening, a terse message acknowledging receipt and suggesting, without stating explicitly, that the midwife had made powerful enemies through this action. The waiting that followed was worse than any previous anxiety. 3 days passed with the documents circulating, but not yet public. Everyone who'd received copies presumably deciding how to respond, strategies being recalibrated, conversations happening in rooms the midwife would never enter. Work continued. Births didn't pause for political drama, but every knock at the door triggered bracing for confrontation. The storm broke on a Thursday morning when the newspaper published the document in full, accompanied by an editorial about the challenges of legitimacy and inheritance in families that valued appearance over truth. The response was immediate and chaotic. The Levine family issued a statement calling the document slanderous lies from a disgruntled former employee, a characterization both inaccurate and revealing in its defensiveness. The Mercier family's lawyers filed their suit the same day, citing the midwife's testimony as supporting evidence for their challenge to Henri's legitimacy. Madame Levine the elder appeared at the midwife's door that afternoon, her face rigid with controlled fury. "You've destroyed us. For what? Spite? Money from our enemies? The satisfaction of ruining a child's life?" The midwife stood in the doorway, refusing entry. "I destroyed nothing. I stated what I witnessed. If that creates problems for your family, perhaps the problems existed before I spoke about them. That boy is innocent. Whatever his parentage, he's done nothing wrong. Now he'll grow up with this scandal attached to his name, his mother's reputation destroyed, his inheritance challenged. You've ruined lives for your principles." The accusation stung because it contained truth. Henri would suffer from this revelation regardless of how the legal matters resolved. His mother would face social consequences that might never fully heal. The family's reputation would carry permanent damage. These weren't abstract concepts. They were real harm to real people, caused at least partially by the midwife's decision to speak. But silence would have caused different harm, perhaps worse. The lawyer would have obtained testimony through legal force. The Mercier family would have weaponized the information regardless. The secret would have emerged eventually, but in forms designed to maximize damage and serve particular agendas. At least this way, the truth existed in its simplest form, available to everyone, beholden to no one. "I'm sorry for the boy," the midwife said quietly. "Truly. But I'm not sorry for telling the truth. Too many people were trying to use what I knew for their own purposes. The only way to stop being useful to everyone was to make the information available to anyone." Madame Levine studied her for a long moment, fury gradually shifting to something more complicated. "You're a fool. You could have been comfortable for life, protected. Now you'll have nothing but the satisfaction of your precious honesty." She departed with that final condemnation, and the midwife closed the door, feeling the weight of uncertainty about whether the right choice had been made. Honesty and rightness weren't necessarily the same thing. Truth could cause harm, even when silence caused different harm. There were no clean answers, just choices and consequences. Celeste appeared that evening with food and practical concern. "The whole city is talking about nothing else. Some people say you're brave, others say you're reckless. A few say you're being paid by the Merciers, though I've been correcting that nonsense wherever I hear it. What do you think?" Celeste considered carefully. "I think you did what you needed to do to survive. Whether it was right or wrong matters less than whether it works. And we won't know that for a while yet." The following days brought a strange mixture of consequences. Some wealthy families stopped calling, clearly deciding the midwife was too controversial for their needs. Others called specifically because of the controversy, wanting someone with proven discretion and the courage to resist pressure. The poor families continued calling as they always had, uninterested in scandals that didn't affect their daily struggles. Madame Rousseau visited unexpectedly, her manner less adversarial than it had been in previous encounters. "You've done something interesting. Several other midwives have come to me saying they've been pressured to provide information about births they attended, asked to testify about things that should remain private. Your example has made them braver about refusing. You may have changed how this works, at least for a while." I wasn't trying to change anything. I was just trying to survive. Most changes start that way. Someone desperate or angry, or simply tired of being used, making a choice that seems small at the time, but shifts something larger. Whether that shift holds depends on what happens next. What happened next was a kind of settling, like sediment after a storm. The Mercier family's lawsuit proceeded through legal channels that would take months or years to resolve. The Levine family retreated into defensive privacy, no longer hosting the social gatherings that had defined their status. Young Henri continued growing, oblivious to, or at least protected from, the full weight of the scandals surrounding him. His mother took him to visit relatives in the country, removing him from the city's gossip and speculation. The newspaper published several follow-up articles, but public attention gradually shifted to newer scandals, more recent crises. The midwife's name remained attached to the story, but faded from daily conversation, becoming a reference point rather than an active controversy. Father Beaumont reported that the church had decided not to take sides in the Levine matter, instead issuing general statements about the sanctity of family and the importance of truth. Political language that satisfied no one, but offended no one sufficiently to create new problems. His tone suggested both approval and resignation about the midwife's choice. You did what your conscience required. The consequences are God's to manage now. The lawyer sent a final communication, acknowledging that the midwife's testimony would not be required in any legal proceedings, the public document having served the necessary evidentiary purpose. His tone was cold, but professional, suggesting that while he might personally disapprove of the method, he recognized its effectiveness. Slowly, carefully, life began resembling something normal again. Work continued, the leather bag traveling through the city's various districts, births arriving with their usual disregard for convenience or planning. The reputation that had been built over years survived the controversy, perhaps even strengthened by it. People knew now that this midwife wouldn't be pressured into compromising professional obligations, wouldn't become a tool for others' schemes. Celeste observed the transformation one Sunday afternoon over their usual coffee. "You look different, less burdened, like you're actually sleeping again." "I'm sleeping some. Enough to function, anyway." "Was it worth it? All the risk, the consequences, the enemies you made?" The midwife considered the question seriously. "I don't know if it was worth it in some grand sense, but I know I couldn't have continued the way things were going. Being useful to everyone while being true to no one, that was killing me slower but just as surely. At least now I can do my work without constantly calculating who I might offend and how to keep everyone satisfied. So you traded complicated misery for honest uncertainty. Something like that. They sat in comfortable silence, two working women who'd survived another season in a city that consumed people without noticing. The future remained unclear, full of potential dangers and possible rewards. But it was an honest future now, built on choices that could be acknowledged, rather than secrets that demanded constant maintenance. Whatever came next would at least be faced directly, without the exhausting pretense that had characterized the past years. That wasn't triumph exactly, but it was something close to freedom, which for someone born without advantages or protection was perhaps the greatest victory available. Morning light filtered through shutters that had been carefully repaired last month, the wood no longer warped from years of river dampness. The room, still modest but genuinely comfortable now, held furniture that wasn't borrowed or salvaged, belongings that represented choices rather than necessities. The leather bag sat by the door, its replacement finally purchased after the old one had literally fallen apart during a difficult birth. Inside were instruments that had been accumulated over decades, some inherited from Madame Thibault, others acquired piece by careful piece as resources allowed. The midwife rose slowly, joints protesting in ways they hadn't when this work began all those years ago. Not old yet, not quite, but definitely past the age when bodies forgave constant demands without complaint. There was satisfaction in that ache, though, evidence of work done, lives helped, the accumulation of purpose across time. Calls still came regularly, though the pattern had shifted in the years since the Lavinia scandal. Fewer wealthy families sought services, but those who did came specifically because they valued discretion that wouldn't compromise under pressure. More middle families, shopkeepers, skilled tradesmen, the growing category of people between poverty and wealth, requested the midwife's attendance. They paid reasonably and treated the work with respect, understanding that bringing life safely into the world required skill earned through experience. The poor families still called as they always had, and those births remained central to the practice. A woman laboring in a room barely large enough for the purpose, surrounded by children who needed feeding, and a husband who needed reassurance. Another woman who'd lost 2 babies already and carried terror through every contraction until the moment her daughter cried. An older mother surprised by late pregnancy, exhausted before labor even began. These births paid little, but mattered most, the core of what the work had always been about. A young woman had begun apprenticing several months ago, recommended by Madame Rousseau, who'd retired from active practice but still maintained connections throughout the city. The apprentice, bright, careful, appropriately frightened by the responsibility, reminded the midwife of herself at that age, hungry to learn and determined to prove competence. Teaching came naturally now, the accumulated knowledge transferring through demonstration and explanation and the occasional story about difficult cases that illustrated important lessons. "Why do you still take calls from families who can barely pay?" the apprentice asked one afternoon while they cleaned instruments. "You've earned the right to be selective." The midwife smiled at the question's innocence. "Because those are the families who need skilled midwives most. Wealthy women have options, physicians, private rooms, the resources to survive complications. Poor women have whatever midwife will come when called. If the good ones only serve those who can pay well, what's left for everyone else? But don't you deserve to benefit from your experience? To have an easier life after all these years?" This is easier. I choose my own calls now, work at my own pace. Don't have to navigate anyone's political schemes. That's luxury enough." The apprentice looked skeptical, but didn't argue further. She'd learn eventually, the midwife thought. Learn that the work itself was the reward. That helping mothers survive and babies thrive created satisfaction no amount of money could purchase. Or she wouldn't learn that, and she'd drift toward easier paths and wealthier clients. Either way was fine. People had to make their own choices about what kind of midwife they wanted to be. Celeste still visited regularly, their friendship having deepened through shared decades and mutual survival of various crises. She'd inherited the button shop when its owner retired, had managed to expand it slightly, had achieved the kind of stable comfort that working people dreamed about, but rarely reached. They sat together on Sunday afternoons, comparing observations about the city's constant changes, the new buildings rising where familiar ones had stood, the shifting populations, as some people prospered and others disappeared. "Remember when we thought the Levine scandal would destroy you?" Celeste said one afternoon, her tone reminiscent rather than worried. "Now it's just another old story people barely remember." Time has that effect. The things that seem enormous in the moment fade into background noise eventually. "Do you ever regret it, speaking out the way you did?" The midwife considered honestly. "Sometimes I wonder what might have happened if I'd chosen differently. Whether staying silent would have been simpler. Whether the harm I caused to that family was justified. But mostly I'm grateful I'm still here, still working, not destroyed by any of the various forces that wanted to use me. That feels like enough." Young Henri Levine had grown into a teenager now, living quietly with his mother in the country most of the year, appearing in the city only for necessary occasions. The lawsuit, challenging his legitimacy, had eventually settled through private agreement, whose terms remained undisclosed, some compromise reached that allowed all parties to claim satisfaction while admitting nothing. The boy's future would be different than originally planned, but he was alive and cared for, which was more than many children could claim. The elderly slave woman who'd spoken to the midwife years ago had gained her freedom somehow. Purchased, inherited, or negotiated, the details unclear, and now worked as a cook in a boarding house. They'd crossed paths at the market once, exchanged brief greetings and careful smiles that acknowledged shared history without discussing it. Some connections existed outside words, built on mutual understanding about survival and the cost of maintaining conscience in difficult circumstances. Father Beaumont had passed away peacefully 2 winters ago, mourned by the community he'd served with complicated loyalty. The new priest was younger, less comfortable with moral ambiguity, more certain about right and wrong. The midwife attended services occasionally, but no longer sought spiritual counsel there, having learned that some questions had no satisfying answers and some burdens couldn't be lifted through prayer alone. Madame Rousseau visited one spring morning, moving slowly now, her hands too unsteady for the detailed work of midwifery. "I'm dying," she announced without preamble. "Not immediately, but soon enough. Wanted to tell you while I still could." The midwife received this information with the calm that came from years of witnessing mortality. "Is there anything you need? Anything I can do? Just remember what I told you about midwives looking out for each other. Keep that tradition alive. Don't let the profession become just another way for wealthy people to control poor ones." "I'll try." "You do more than try. You've already proven that. Just keep doing it." They sat together in comfortable silence, two women who'd navigated the same dangerous city through different paths, united by craft and mutual respect. When Madame Rousseau finally left, the midwife understood it was probably the last time they'd speak. Another connection severing, another piece of history becoming memory. The apprentice showed promise, but still struggled with the emotional weight of the work, the way each birth carried not just medical stakes, but entire families' hopes and fears. "How do you not take it home with you?" she asked, after a particularly difficult delivery that had required every bit of skill to prevent tragedy. "How do you leave the worry behind and sleep?" "You don't, always. Some births stay with you for years. But you learn to carry them differently, to understand that you did what could be done and the rest wasn't yours to control. That's not coldness, it's survival. If you carried every worry fully, you'd collapse under the weight." The city continued its endless transformation, new buildings rising and old ones falling, populations shifting as waves of immigrants arrived and established residents departed. The Mississippi flowed on, indifferent to human drama, carrying ships from impossible distances and returning them to equally impossible destinations. Yellow fever came some summers and spared the city others, following logic nobody could predict. Politics churned with the usual combination of ambition and corruption, and occasional genuine concern for public welfare. Through all of it, babies insisted on being born. Mothers needed help surviving the process, and midwives provided the bridge between potential and actuality. The work continued, generation after generation, the essential task that preceded and would outlast every other human endeavor. On quiet mornings, when the apprentice hadn't yet arrived and no calls had come, the midwife sometimes sat with coffee and simply observed the day beginning. Vendors calling their wares in the street below, the smell of bread from the bakery 2 buildings over, the soft light that made even shabby architecture look momentarily beautiful. These simple pleasures felt earned in ways that wealth never quite could, purchased not with money, but with years of difficult choices, dangerous knowledge carefully managed, conscience maintained despite pressures to compromise. The future stretched ahead with typical uncertainty. The apprentice might or might not develop into a skilled midwife. The city might or might not slide toward crisis as political tensions escalated. The body might or might not cooperate for years more of demanding work. None of it was controllable, which was either terrifying or liberating, depending on perspective. What was certain, the work mattered, had always mattered, would continue mattering regardless of what scandals erupted or which powerful families rose or fell. Women would keep needing help bringing children into the world, and as long as strength permitted, this midwife would keep providing that help. Not for glory or wealth or social standing, but simply because it was work worth doing, because skill applied to necessity created value that transcended individual circumstances. The leather bag waited by the door, ready for whatever call came next. The instruments inside had delivered hundreds of babies, saved dozens of lives, witnessed the full range of human experience, from joy to tragedy. They were just tools, metal and cloth and carefully mixed remedies. But in skilled hands, they became something more.
the practical expression of knowledge passed down through generations, the tangible evidence that expertise and compassion could combine to fight back against suffering. Outside, the city woke fully to another day of commerce and survival, ambition and desperation, the endless human project of trying to build something meaningful from the chaos of existence. And somewhere in those crowded streets, a family would soon need a midwife. Another baby would insist on entering the world. Another life would hang in the balance between skill and chance. When that call came, today or tomorrow or the day after, the bag would be lifted, the door opened, the work continued.
Not because it was easy or always rewarding, but because it was necessary. And necessity, properly honored, was its own kind of nobility. The city had taught that lesson through years of difficulty and danger, and the knowledge remained, settled deep, unshakable as the river that defined everything, carrying its own current toward an ocean it would never see, but trusted absolutely to exist.